They say that a woman holding a hammer is a bad omen. They say that a stranger without roots is not trustworthy. And they said that someone like Anika Van Doren, big, taciturn, no husband, no children, no one standing behind her, should just turn around and walk away. But Anika did not walk away. She put her father's toolbox down in the middle of Red Mesa, looked straight into the disdainful eyes, and spoke with her own hammer. This story is for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong here. Like, comment on the name of the city you're viewing, so I know how far my story has come, and follow the channel so you don't miss Anika's journey to the end. The stagecoach dropped her off at the edge of Red Mesa like it was relieving itself of something unpleasant. Anika Van Doren stepped down from the coach before the driver fully stopped, which was less dramatic than it sounds. She simply didn't want to wait for the man to decide whether he felt like helping her. And she was right not to wait, because he didn't. He threw her trunk down from the roof without warning and drove off while she was still bending to pick it up, leaving a cloud of ochre dust that coated her coat and her hair and the back of her neck. She stood there for a moment in the dust, holding the handle of her late father's toolbox in one hand and the torn corner of a newspaper advertisement in the other. She'd folded and unfolded that scrap of paper so many times over the past 3 weeks that it was starting to come apart along the creases. Skilled builder seeks experienced carpenters for residential construction in Red Mesa territory. Wages fair. Inquire at Cross & Sons Lumber, Main Street. She tucked the paper into her coat pocket, squared her shoulders, picked up her trunk. Red Mesa was not a town that made you feel welcome. That wasn't an impression. It was the architecture. The buildings pressed close to the street, windows narrow, as if the whole place was trying to see as little of the outside world as possible. There was a hardware store with bars over the windows, a saloon with a door that didn't hang properly, and a row of storefronts that hadn't been painted since someone built them 10 years ago and hadn't gotten around to caring since. A group of men stood outside the general store, doing nothing in particular. They noticed her the way men in small towns notice things, not by turning to look, but by going quiet. Conversations didn't stop exactly. They just gradually lost altitude until there was nothing left. Anika kept walking. She had learned in her 31 years that the worst thing you could do with that kind of attention was acknowledge it. You just walked. You kept your face level and your stride even, and you didn't let them see that you knew. She knew. Main Street ran straight through the middle of town, which was convenient. Cross & Sons Lumber sat at the far end, backed up against a lumber yard that smelled of fresh-cut pine and sawdust, which was the best smell Anika had encountered since leaving Amsterdam 14 months ago. She stopped outside the front door, set down her trunk, and read the sign 3 times. Then she went in. The man behind the counter was young, mid-20s, with a ledger open in front of him that he appeared to be arguing with internally. He looked up when she came in, then looked back down, then looked up again when he registered that she was still standing there. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Gideon Cross." "He's out back." The young man, a clerk, she guessed, or possibly a son, given the name on the sign, looked at her with open curiosity that he didn't bother disguising. "You the one who wired ahead about the carpenter position?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I'll get him." He disappeared through a back door, and Anika waited, looking around the shop. It was a good space, well organized. Lumber sorted by grade and dimension along the left wall. Hardware hung on pegboards behind the counter. There was a corkboard near the door with notices pinned to it. Town meetings, a lost mule, a hand-drawn map of property lots. She was still reading the map when the back door opened again. The man who came in was not what she'd expected, which was fine, because she hadn't expected much. He was around 40, she thought, though it was hard to say. He had the kind of face that weather and work had made their own. Dark hair gone partly gray at the temples, and the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than wanting to look like you did labor. He was holding a piece of lumber under one arm like he'd forgotten to put it down before coming to find her, which he probably had. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You wired ahead," he said. It wasn't a question. "Anika Van Doren," she said. "I answered your advertisement." His eyes moved to the toolbox, then back to her face. "You're a carpenter." "My father taught me the trade before he died. I've been working construction in Philadelphia, and before that in Rotterdam, I have references from both. She reached into her coat and produced a folded envelope, which she set on the counter between them. Gideon Cross looked at the envelope. He did not pick it up. He set the piece of lumber down on the counter very slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. I wasn't expecting, he started. A woman, she said. I was going to say someone from out east. You were going to say a woman, Anika said. It's all right. Most people start there. The references are from my foreman, not my family. Both of them will say the same thing, which is that I show up on time, I work clean, and I don't waste materials. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the town going about its business, a cart going past on the street, two men arguing about something a block away, a dog barking at nothing. What was it in Rotterdam, he asked. Restoration work on a merchant hall, 18th century joinery mostly. We replaced the gallery supports and relaid the floor. She paused. Before that, I worked for my father. He was a furniture maker. I started cutting joints at 7 years old, so you can decide whether to count that in the experience column or not. He looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly, just like a man who was trying to solve an equation he hadn't been handed all the variables for. You mind showing me something? He said. That's why I brought the toolbox. He took her out back. The lumberyard was bigger than it looked from the street, maybe 60 feet deep, with stacked boards running the full length and a workbench along the far wall that had been used hard for years and showed it. There was a construction frame set up in the corner, rough timber, maybe 6 feet square, that looked like it had been assembled partly as a test and partly as something to do when nothing else was happening. Gideon pointed to it. Tell me what you see. Anika set down her toolbox, opened it, and walked to the frame. She crouched, looked at the corners, ran her thumb along one of the joints, stood up, looked at the whole thing from a distance. The corner braces are cut to 60 degrees when they should be 45, she said. It'll hold weight in the short term, but it'll rack sideways in a hard wind. You'll see it start to lean within a year if it's load-bearing. She pointed to the top plate. That one's cupped. You'd want to flip it crown up or it'll trap water and rot from the center. She paused. Do you want me to fix it, or are we still in the proving stage? Gideon's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Fix it, he said. She opened her toolbox. Her father's tools were the only things she had taken when she left Amsterdam. Not the furniture. She couldn't carry furniture. Not his books or his letters, just the tools. Because the tools were him in a way that nothing else was. The worn handles and the balanced weight of the mallet and the chisels that still held an edge because he had cared for them obsessively. She had hated him for years, and she had loved him the same way. And when he died, the only thing she'd felt clearly, underneath everything else, was that she couldn't leave the tools behind. She worked quietly. She didn't perform it, didn't make a show of the precision or try to be impressive. She just did the work the way she always did, which was carefully and with her full attention. Gideon watched from about 10 feet away, arms crossed, not interfering. It took her 23 minutes to correct the corner braces, flip the cupped plate, and re-square the frame. When she was done, she ran a level along each face, checked the diagonals, and stepped back. You want to check it? She said. He came forward and looked. He checked the corners himself, hands on, the way a man does when he genuinely wants to know rather than when he's trying to look thorough. He checked the diagonals. He stood back and looked at the whole thing. Where'd you stay last night? He said. I didn't. I was on the coach. The boarding house on Birch Street is run by a woman named Marjorie Holt. She's not what you'd call warm, but she's clean, and she doesn't charge extra for being a woman alone. He picked up one of her chisels, examined the edge, and set it down again. Job pays $18 a month plus a meal when we're on a long day. I've got 3 other men on the site right now. You'll start tomorrow morning. Anika looked at him. That's it? She said. You fixed it in under half an hour and you knew the cupped board without touching it. What else do I need? She had not anticipated this moment being easy. Had spent 3 weeks on the coach bracing for a door being closed in her face, for a polite dismissal or an impolite one, for having to argue or bargain or shame someone into giving her a chance. She had not braced for a man to simply look at the work and say yes. All right, she said. I'll be there at sunrise. 6 o'clock, Gideon said. Don't be early. The site's not lit before then. Don't be late either. He went back inside. Anika stood in the lumberyard for a moment, alone with the smell of pine and the sound of the town going on around her. The afternoon light was going orange over the rooftops. She picked up her toolbox and her trunk and walked toward Birch Street. Marjorie Holt was exactly as described. She was a small woman with a large presence and a face that suggested she had once had strong opinions about things and had gradually replaced them with one comprehensive opinion, which was that people were mostly disappointing. She looked Anika up and down in the doorway of the boarding house with the thoroughness of a customs official. "You got work?" she said. "Yes, starting tomorrow with Gideon Cross." Something shifted in Marjorie's face. Not softened. The word soft didn't apply, but recalibrated. "Cross hired you?" "He did." Another long look. "Room's $2 a week, breakfast included. Supper if you give me notice before noon. I don't allow smoking on the second floor. I don't allow men past the front parlor, and I don't allow noise after 9 o'clock. She stepped back from the door. "You want the room or not?" "Yes," Anika said. "Thank you." The room was small and clean, which was more than she had been expecting. The bed had a quilt on it that had been washed recently. There was a window that looked out over a narrow alley, and if you leaned out far enough, you could see a sliver of sky over the rooftops going the deep blue of early evening. Anika sat on the edge of the bed with her toolbox at her feet and ate a piece of bread she'd had in her pocket since that morning. Outside, Red Mesa settled into its evening. Men heading home, the saloon filling up, horses at the rail. The ordinary sounds of a small frontier town going about the business of ending a day. She had been here 5 hours. She had a room and a job. She was ahead of where she'd been most of the last year. She didn't let herself feel good about it yet. The construction site was a 40-minute walk north of town, up a road that was mostly wheel ruts and ambition, and Anika arrived exactly at 6 o'clock to find 3 men already there, looking at her. The tallest one had a beard that started at his cheekbones and seemed to be trying to reach his chest. He introduced himself as Walt, which he apparently felt was sufficient. The second man was younger, maybe 22, with a dust-colored hat and the kind of anxious energy that came from caring too much about what other people thought. His name was Cobb. The third man didn't introduce himself at all and spent the first 10 minutes of the morning as though Anika were not there, which was, she acknowledged privately, one way to handle it. "That's Rutherford," Cobb said quietly when the third man's back was turned. "He's like that with everybody. Don't take it personal." "I won't," Anika said. Gideon arrived at 6:10 with a roll of plans under one arm and a tin cup of coffee in the other hand that he clearly was not going to share. He unrolled the plans on a makeshift table of boards and sawhorses, and Anika looked at them for the first time. The house was ambitious. That was her first thought. It was 2 stories, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and a rear addition that would serve as a workshop. The framing was straightforward enough, but the second-floor joinery was detailed. Crown molding specified, a box beam ceiling in the main room, built-in cabinetry along the east wall of what appeared to be a study. "Whose house is this?" she said. "Mine," Gideon said, not looking up from the plans. She looked at him sideways. A man building his own house. That explained a certain amount. "You drew these?" "I had help with the technical specifications. The rest is mine." He pointed to the east elevation. "This addition's the part I'm most concerned about. The terrain drops off behind the property. There's about a 6-foot grade change over 20 feet. We'll need to run a retaining wall before we can pour the foundation slab." "What's the soil like?" "Clay, mostly. It's been dry this summer, which helps, but spring will be a different problem." Anika studied the grade notation on the plans. "You'll want to run drainage tile before you close that wall. Otherwise, you're just building a dam." Gideon looked up from the plans, looked at her. "That's what I was thinking." "Good," she said. "Then we're starting from the same page." The morning went to work. By the end of the first week, the rhythm of the site had settled into something functional, if not exactly comfortable. Anika worked without complaint, without drama, and without making any attempt to assert herself beyond the work itself. This was a strategy she had learned over years. The most effective thing you could do when people were looking for a reason to dismiss you was to not give them one. You showed up. You did the work. You did it well. You let that be the argument. Walt turned out to be competent in a straight-ahead, uncomplicated way. He knew framing and he was fast at it, which was useful. Cobb was less experienced but eager to learn, which was the next best thing. Rutherford, whose first name she eventually learned was Daniel, though nobody used it, was a skilled Finnish carpenter with a precise, deliberate way of working that she recognized because she had it herself. He still spoke to her minimally, but he had stopped doing it in a way that felt like a statement. She took that as progress. The house was going up fast. The footing trenches had been dug before she arrived, and in the first week they poured the foundation sections and started laying the sill plates. By the end of the second week, the framing crew, Gideon included, on the days he wasn't handling materials, had the ground floor walls up and braced. Anika worked on the south-facing walls, where the window openings would go, cutting headers and trimmers with the efficiency of someone who had done it a few thousand times. On Thursday of the second week, Gideon came to look at her work and didn't say anything for a minute. "Something wrong?" she said. "No." He ran a hand along the top of the window rough opening. "Window's going to sit level." "That's the goal," she said. Rutherford's windows from the last project had to be shimmied half an inch on one side, Gideon said. "Don't tell him I said that." Annika went back to work. She didn't smile, but it was a near thing. Ushit. It was on a Friday evening, walking back toward town, that she first encountered Victor Hale. She wouldn't have known who he was, except that Red Mesa was the kind of place where certain men announced themselves by the way they moved through space. Victor Hale moved as if the street had been built for him specifically. A tall man in his late 50s, wide through the shoulders, with a silver watch chain and the composed expression of someone who had been told yes for such a long time that yes was the only answer he could still hear. He was walking toward her on the main street with another man at his elbow, younger, with a ledger under his arm, trying to keep up. And he saw Anika from 20 feet away and did not immediately look away, which already told her something. She kept walking. He slowed. "You're the woman Cross hired," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a classification. "Anika Van Doren," she said. She stopped, because stopping was better than being stopped. "You are." "Victor Hale." He said it the way men say their own names when they believe the name should do work for them. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Good evening." She went to walk on. He didn't exactly block her way. It was more that he positioned himself as though her walking on would be a choice she'd made despite his preference. "Red Mesa's a specific kind of place," he said. "The people here have built something over a long time. There are standards, expectations." He looked at her levelly. "Standards that the people here understand and value." "I imagine they do," Anika said. "I'm not sure all newcomers understand what they're walking into." She looked at him for a moment. She had been in the territory 8 days. This was not the first time someone had implied in the gentle vocabulary of men who never say things directly that her presence was unwelcome. It wouldn't be the last. She had learned that the clearest response was also the shortest. "I'm walking into a boarding house on Birch Street," she said. "Good night, Mr. Hale." She walked on. She could feel his eyes on her back for half a block, but he didn't say anything more, and she didn't turn around. The boarding house was quiet by the time she got back. Marjorie Holt was in the kitchen, doing something productive with flour. Annika sat at the table in the small dining room and ate supper alone, which was bread and beans and a slice of dried beef, and it was fine. "Victor Hale stopped me on the street," she said. Marjorie came to the doorway and looked at her. "He say anything?" "The usual, standards, expectations, the implication that I might not understand what I was walking into." Marjorie made a sound that was not quite a word. She went back into the kitchen. After a moment, she came back with a second cup of coffee and set it in front of Anika without ceremony. "Victor Hale has his hand in everything in this town," Marjorie said, sitting down across from her. "The bank, the planning board, the water rights on the north side of town. He's been trying to buy Gideon's land for 3 years. "Why?" "Because it sits between Hale's property to the west and the main road to the east. He wants to expand. Built himself a warehouse 2 years ago that's too small, and he can't go south because the creek floods. Gideon won't sell. Gideon doesn't seem like a man who'd sell. No. Marjorie's mouth did something that might have been the distant relative of a smile. He's not. Victor knows that. He just hasn't decided what to do about it yet. She looked at Anika steadily. You being there is going to complicate things. I'm a carpenter, Anika said. I'm building a house. I know what you're doing. Victor Hale will see it as something else. Marjorie stood up, took her cup back to the kitchen. Don't say I didn't tell you. The house climbed. By the end of the third week, the second-floor walls were framed and the roof trusses were going up. Anika worked on the interior framing for the study, the room with the built-in cabinetry that Gideon seemed to care most about, though he'd never said so directly. She could tell by the way he came and looked at it more often than the other rooms, checking the measurements against the plan, standing in the empty space with the same look on his face that she occasionally caught when he thought no one was paying attention. Not quite satisfied, not quite not, the expression of a man trying to picture something that didn't exist yet and needing to confirm it was going to. She was fitting one of the cabinet partition posts on Thursday morning when she realized he was watching her from the doorway. Box beam ceiling, she said without turning around. You want the beams to look structural even though they're decorative, so the joints need to read clean from 12 feet below. You've done this before, he said. In Rotterdam. Merchant Hall. Different style, same principle. She set the post and checked it with her level. You'll want to pick your wood carefully for those beams, something with visible grain. White oak, if you can get it shipped. Fir will work, but it'll look like what it is. I'll look into the oak. He came into the room, looked at the post, looked at the wall. This room was my father's idea originally. He always wanted a proper study. Is he dead? Yes, 4 years ago. He said it the way people say things they've said 100 times, where the words have been worn smooth by repetition. He started the lumber yard. I took it over. He paused. He always said he'd build a proper house eventually. He never did. Anika looked at the post in her hand. The wood was smooth from planing, the grain close and even. Good material. That's why you're building it, she said. Partly, Gideon said. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask him to. She went back to work. After a moment, he went back outside. The first act of sabotage happened on a Monday. She arrived at the site to find Walt and Cobb standing outside the lumber delivery area, which was empty. The load of framing lumber that Gideon had ordered for the week, 200 board feet of dimensional stock, had not arrived. Gideon rode out from the lumber yard at 7:30 with a look that said he already knew what she was going to tell him. Mertens won't fill the order, he said. He dismounted, didn't tie his horse. The horse knew to stay. Says he's oversold, doesn't have the stock. You ordered 3 weeks ago, Anika said. I know. Did he have stock last week? He had stock last week. She looked at him. He looked at her. They both knew what it was, and they both knew that knowing what it was didn't get 200 board feet of lumber onto the site. There's a mill at Vernon, she said. How far? 18 miles. You ride hard, you're there by noon. You load and you're back by dark. She paused. I can frame the South Edition with what we have on hand and lose maybe half a day. Gideon looked at the site. He looked at the clear sky and the dry road. He nodded once and rode. Chut. He came back at dusk with the lumber on a hired flatbed, looking tired and sun-cooked and something else, something that took her a moment to identify as quietly furious in the way that men get when they have been given the runaround and have had 18 miles to ride while thinking about it. They unloaded together while Walt and Cobb had gone home for the day, and Rutherford, who lived closer, had come back to help. Vernon Mill charged me 10% more than Merton's price, Gideon said, stacking boards. Is that sustainable? She said. For a while. He set a board down harder than necessary. Victor Hale owns 20% of Merton's mill. I just remembered that. Anika stacked a board on top of his. I see. I should have remembered that earlier. You had other things to think about. She picked up the next board. What do you want to do? Gideon straightened, hands on his hips, looking at the half-built house against the purple-orange sky. The framing stood clean against the light, the work of the past 3 weeks, the thing that was starting to look like what it was supposed to look like. "I want to finish the house," he said. "All right," she said. "Then that's what we do." They finished unloading in the dark, with a lantern hung from the scaffold post, and neither of them said much else. The following week, the town planning office sent a man to the site. He was a round person with a clipboard and an official manner that was doing a lot of work covering for the fact that he didn't really want to be there. He informed Gideon that there had been a complaint filed regarding the construction, specifically that the rear addition exceeded the allowable setback from the property line. Gideon took the clipboard and looked at it. Who filed the complaint? That information is it Victor Hale? The man with the clipboard looked at his shoes. "What's the setback you're claiming we exceeded?" Annika said. The man with the clipboard told her. She did the math in her head, then turned to the half-built rear wall and counted paces from the wall to the surveyed property corner. "We're 14 inches inside the setback," she said. The man with the clipboard wrote something down. 14 inches, Gideon said. He said it very quietly, which was worse than saying it loudly. "I'll note that in my report," the clipboard man said. "There'll be an official review period of 30 days. You can continue construction." He paused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cross. It's not—" He stopped. "I'll file the measurement." He left quickly. Good instincts. Gideon stood looking at the property corner. The afternoon light was flat and hot. 30 days, he said. 30 days, Annika said. Then they drop it. She looked at him. "It's paper, Gideon. It's not the house." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Go back to work?" "Go back to work," she said. They went back to work. It was on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks into the planning board complaint, that something happened that she hadn't planned for. She was working late on the interior trim of the study, the kind of work that went better without 3 other people on the site, in the quieter hours when the light came in low and you could see the grain of the wood clearly. She was fitting the first of the cabinet face frames when she heard Gideon come in behind her. He had a habit of working late too. She'd noticed it. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't an accusation. "Detail work," she said. "I don't like being rushed on the joints." He looked at the face frame. She'd cut the mortise and tenon by hand, the way her father had taught her. Not because it was faster, but because the mechanical joint cutters never got the fit quite right, and you always ended up shimming anyway. The joint was clean and tight, no gap. "My father used to say," Gideon started, then stopped. "What?" He crouched down to look at the joint at eye level. "He used to say you could tell everything about a carpenter from the joints they thought nobody would see." "He wasn't wrong," Annika said. Gideon stayed crouched, looking at the joint, and then he looked up at her, and there was something in his face that she wasn't prepared for. Not a dramatic thing, nothing theatrical, just a kind of look that said he was seeing her clearly rather than seeing what he expected to see. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Whatever else is happening with Hale and the board and all of it. I'm glad you answered the advertisement." Annika looked at the face frame. The joint was tight. The grain matched across the seam, which she'd done on purpose, selecting the board specifically, because that's what her father would have done. "So am I," she said. "Now let me finish this." He stood up and went back to whatever he'd been doing in the other room, and Annika went back to the trim work, and the house settled around them in the quiet way that buildings do when the work is going right. Not perfectly, not without trouble, but honestly, the way things are built to last. Outside, Red Mesa was doing whatever it did in the evening. Victor Hale was somewhere in it, turning over his options. The planning board had 23 more days on its complaint clock, but in here, in the room that would be a study with a box beam ceiling and white oak when she could get it, the joinery was clean and the fit was true, and the work that nobody would see was the best work she had ever done. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. The planning board complaint was dropped on a Thursday morning, 14 days before the deadline, which should have felt like a victory. It didn't. Annika had been around long enough to know that when a man like Victor Hale retreated from something, it wasn't because he'd changed his mind. It was because he'd found a better angle. She found out about it from Cobb, who had heard it from a man at the feed store, who had apparently heard it from someone at the planning office itself. The complaint had been withdrawn without explanation. No letter to Gideon, no formal notice. Just a quiet removal, the way you'd take a piece off a chessboard when you'd decided to try a different opening. "That's good news, isn't it?" Cobb said. He was on the scaffold cutting rafter tails, and he looked down at her with an expression that wanted to be reassured. "Probably," Anika said. She went back to what she was doing, which was laying out the box beam measurements for the study ceiling. She wrote the numbers down twice. Her father had always written numbers down twice. When Gideon arrived at the site that afternoon, she told him. He nodded slowly, set his coffee down on a saw bench. He gave up. "He stopped," she said. "That's different." Gideon looked at her for a moment, then picked up his coffee again. "I know," he said. "I just needed a second to pretend." The lumber situation resolved itself partially when Gideon found a second supplier out of Kellerton, 40 miles east, who was willing to deliver on a standing order at a reasonable rate. It wasn't as convenient as Merton's had been, and the delivery schedule was slower, but it was workable. You adapted. That was the job. What was less workable was what started happening with the other tradesmen in town. The glazier, who was supposed to supply the window glass for the second floor, sent a message saying his stock was delayed from the factory. This was plausible. Glass shipments from the east were notoriously unreliable. But then the man who sold finish hardware, hinges, lock sets, the brass fittings for the cabinet doors in the study, told Gideon that he was out of the specific sizes needed and wasn't sure when he'd be restocked. And then the brick supplier, who was to deliver the chimney course material, sent word that his wagon had a broken axle, and he wasn't sure of the timeline. 3 suppliers in 2 weeks, all with different reasons, all arriving at the same inconvenient time. Walt noticed first, or at least said it first. He was not a man who filtered much. "Somebody's talking to them," he said one morning, not even looking up from the board he was cutting. "That's not coincidence, that's coordination." Nobody argued with him. Anika didn't say anything out loud, but she spent that evening at the boarding house table with a piece of paper, writing down the sequence of events since she'd arrived. The planning complaint filed 2 weeks after she started, the lumber supplier withdrawing, now the tradesman. The timing wasn't random. Someone was working through a list, and they were being methodical about it. Marjorie came in and looked at the paper without asking to. "Hale," she said. "I think so." "You think he's expecting Gideon to fire you?" Anika looked at the paper. "I think he's expecting Gideon to eventually decide I'm not worth the trouble." Marjorie sat down across from her. This was unusual. Marjorie generally treated the dining room as a space where guests ate and she supervised, not as a place she occupied socially. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at Anika with an expression that was not quite sympathy, which was fine, because Anika hadn't asked for sympathy. "Is he right?" Marjorie said. "Gideon? No, Gideon hasn't said a word about it." "That's not what I asked." Anika looked at her. "I asked if Hale is right," Marjorie said, "about whether you're worth the trouble." Anika folded the paper in half. "The house is going up on schedule," she said. "The joinery and the study is the best work I've done in 3 years. Whatever else is happening, the house is going up." Marjorie looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she stood up and went back to the kitchen. "More coffee," she said, which was not a question. Bertat. It was Walt who told her what people in town were saying, because Walt communicated in the same register whether he was talking about lumber grades or rumor, and apparently saw no reason to spare her. They were framing the porch posts on a Tuesday morning. Walt was on one side, Anika on the other, wrestling a post into its base bracket while Cobb held the plumb bob. "Saying you're sleeping with him," Walt said conversationally. Anika didn't answer immediately because the post was being difficult and she was using both hands. "Who's saying it?" she said. "Town," Walt said, which was specific enough. "Also that you lied about your credentials, that the references are forged, that you worked a construction site in Philadelphia and got a man killed through negligence." He checked his end of the post. "None of that's true, I assume." "The Philadelphia part," Anika said. "There was an accident, a scaffold collapse, before I started on the site. The foreman who was injured died 6 weeks later. His name was William Ash." She tightened the bracket bolt. "I was not on that site when it happened. I started 3 weeks after. You can ask John Ferris in Philadelphia, who's one of the names on my references, and he'll tell you the same thing. Walt looked at her. I didn't think it was true, he said. I'm telling you what they're saying. I know, she said. I appreciate it. Cobb was looking at them from behind the plumb bob with the expression of someone who had walked into the middle of a conversation about something heavier than he'd prepared for. Does Mr. Cross know? He said. I'll tell him tonight, Anika said. She picked up the next post. Let's keep moving. She didn't tell Gideon that night. She told him at the site the next morning while everyone else was getting set up for the day, and she told him straight the rumors, the specific details, the scaffold accident and William Ash's name and the timeline that cleared her of it. She didn't apologize for any of it because she had nothing to apologize for, and she didn't soften it because softening it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Gideon listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that she had come to appreciate. A lot of men interrupted because they wanted you to know they'd already understood before you finished. Gideon waited until you were actually done. William Ash, he said. He was a good foreman by all accounts. I never met him. And Ferris will confirm the timeline. Yes. Gideon looked at the house. The porch posts were going up on the front elevation, and from where they stood you could see the shape of what it was going to be. The covered porch running the full width, the second floor windows, the roof line. I'm not asking you to confirm anything, he said. I'm telling you so you know what's being said. I know what's being said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite level. Victor Hale had dinner with 3 members of the planning board last week. He also had a conversation with the postmaster's son, who talks to everyone. He paused. The thing about small towns is that the information flows in a circle. Somebody talks to somebody who talks to somebody. It's efficient for gossip. And for deciding what you think about a person before you've met them, Anika said. Yes. That too. He turned to look at her. Do you want to address it directly? There's a town meeting at the end of the month. You could speak. Anika thought about it. She thought about standing up in a room full of people who had already decided what they thought of her, explaining a scaffold accident she hadn't been present for, defending credentials that were genuine against rumors that were invented. She thought about what that room would feel like. Not yet, she said. Gideon nodded. All right. The house needs to speak first, she said. Let them see the work. He looked at the porch line again. 2 more weeks on the exterior, he said. Then we start the interior finishes. Then we start, she said. The next complication came from a direction she hadn't expected, which in retrospect she should have, because the directions you don't anticipate are always the ones that matter. A woman named Caroline Peirce came to the site on a Friday afternoon. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who understood that presentation was a form of argument, and she arrived in a small buggy that she drove herself, which Anika noted. Gideon recognized her from across the yard, and his jaw did something that wasn't quite setting, but was adjacent to it. Caroline Peirce was, as it turned out, a member of the town's Civic Improvement Committee, an organization that concerned itself with the character and reputation of Red Mesa, which was a polite way of saying it concerned itself with who was and wasn't acceptable. She came, she said, as a courtesy. She wanted Gideon to understand that the committee was not opposed to construction, not opposed to progress, certainly not opposed to Gideon personally, whom everyone respected. But, Gideon said. But there's a concern about the kind of example it sets, Caroline Peirce said. She did not look at Anika directly, which was its own statement. The territory is growing. People are watching how Red Mesa manages its standards. What standards specifically? Anika said. Caroline Peirce looked at her then. The look was measured and not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been unkind. The trades have always been a particular kind of work, she said. There's nothing wrong with a woman being capable. But what it says to a community when those distinctions are blurred... What it says, Anika said, is that the work got done. A silence. Mrs. Van Doren. Miss, Anika said. Another silence. Miss Van Doren, Caroline Peirce said carefully. I'm not your enemy. I didn't say you were, Anika said. I said the work got done. The framing is square. The foundation is solid. and the joinery in the interior is the best I'm capable of. That's what I said. She paused. Is there something specific about the construction you'd like to discuss? Caroline Peirce looked at her for a moment longer, then looked at Gideon. I hope you'll consider the position you're putting yourself in, she said. It was addressed to him, not Annika. Gideon crossed his arms. Caroline, he said, I've got 3 hours of light left and a porch ceiling to finish. Is there something else? She left. Cobb watched the buggy go down the road and let out a long, slow breath. That was polite, he said, with the air of someone revising their definition of polite. That was a warning, Rutherford said, which was the most he'd said at one time in 4 weeks. He went back to his work. The evening of the civic committee visit, Annika sat on the steps of the boarding house in the cooling dark and thought about the letter she'd received that morning, which she hadn't mentioned to anyone. It was from her older brother Jan, written in Dutch in his tight, economical handwriting. Jan ran the family furniture workshop in Amsterdam, had run it since their father died, and had managed to run it with the specific competence of a man who had been given something he'd always expected and couldn't quite believe required work. The letter was businesslike. It told her that the workshop was doing well, that he had hired 2 apprentices, that things were going forward, and at the end, in the slightly tighter handwriting that Jan used when he was trying to make something sound casual. If you should find yourself without a situation in the territories, the workshop could accommodate a return. You always had father's eye for wood. She folded the letter and put it in her coat. If you should find yourself without a situation. That was Jan's way of saying he thought she would fail. That was Jan's way of leaving a door open that he assumed she'd eventually have to crawl through. He wasn't cruel. He'd never been cruel, just chronically certain that Annika's version of things was going to collapse eventually into his version of things, which was smaller and safer and inside where he could see it. She had left Amsterdam because of that certainty, because of the particular way John assumed she'd come back. The night air was warm and carried the smell of dust and something flowering somewhere that she couldn't identify. Down the street, the saloon had its usual sound. Somewhere a door closed. She would not be without a situation. The house was going up. She was good at this, better than good, and she was done being modest about it to herself, even if she'd be measured about it everywhere else. The work was good. The work was real. She went inside. The hardest moment came on a Saturday, the kind of clear sky day that made the territory look like it had been built for the purpose of being beautiful, which was irritating when you were trying to work through something difficult. She had gone to the hardware store for a small order, specific screws for the cabinet hardware, an item she'd placed 2 weeks prior. The man behind the counter, a quiet person named Aldrich whom she'd dealt with before without incident, looked at her when she came in and then looked at the counter. Your order, he said. He slid a paper toward her. It was her original order sheet, unchanged. You don't have it? She said. I can't fill it, he said. He was still looking at the counter. Can't or won't, Annika said. He looked up at her then, and she saw in his face that he was not a bad person and that it wasn't making any difference. I'm sorry, he said. It was genuine, which almost made it worse. She picked up her order sheet and walked out. She didn't go straight back to the site. She walked to the end of Main Street, past the edge of where the building stopped and the road went out into the open territory, and she stood there for a while in the sun looking at the land. It stretched out flat and brown and enormous, the kind of landscape that doesn't care about your problems, which was sometimes a comfort. She had been called too big in every sense of the word her whole life, too large, too loud, too much, too interested in the wrong things, too Dutch in Amsterdam and too foreign in Philadelphia and too female everywhere. She had built her whole working life on proving that none of that mattered if the work was right. But there were moments, and this was one, when she let herself feel how tired it was, being the argument, being the proof, showing up every morning and doing the work as if the work itself could solve the problem of being who she was in a world that kept wanting her to be something else. She stood there for a few minutes. Then she turned around and walked back toward the site. Gideon was there when she arrived. He looked at her when she came through the gate, not with worry exactly, but with attention. Aldrich won't fill the order, she said. He was quiet for a second. I'll call in to Kellerton. I know. She set down her bag. It's fine. It's just. She stopped. I know, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the house. The porch was almost done, the exterior trim was going up, and the thing that had been a plan on paper 8 weeks ago was standing up in the world like it intended to stay. It's a good house, she said. It is, Gideon said, and it's getting better. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Walt and Cobb were on the second floor, and the sound of their work came down steady and familiar, the clean sound of building something that wanted to be built. She picked up her tools and went to work. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Wednesday, which was an ordinary enough day until it wasn't. Gideon brought it to the site himself, which told her something before he even opened his mouth, because Gideon didn't usually come out until mid-morning, and it was barely past 7. He rode up while she and Rutherford were laying out the interior trim cuts for the main hallway, and he dismounted without tying the horse again, and she had learned by now that this meant his mind was somewhere else entirely. "We have a problem," he said. He handed her the letter. She read it once quickly, then read it again more slowly, the way you read something when the first reading doesn't quite land because what it's saying doesn't make immediate sense. The letter was from the Territorial Land Records Office in the capital. It stated that a formal petition had been filed challenging the legal title to the property at the described location, Gideon's land, the 40 acres his father had settled 22 years ago, and that Gideon had inherited and built the lumberyard on and was now building his house on. The petition claimed that the original survey of the property contained errors that invalidated the title transfer. A hearing had been scheduled before the Territorial Land Commissioner in 30 days. The petition had been filed by a law firm in the capital. The name on the filing as interested party was Victor Hale. Anika read the letter a third time. Then she handed it back. "He's claiming the survey was wrong," she said. "He's claiming the original survey markers were placed incorrectly when my father filed the claim. That the eastern boundary was drawn wrong, which means the title transfer from the territory to my father was invalid, which means I don't legally own the land." Gideon folded the letter. He folded it carefully, the way you handle something you're trying not to crush in your hands. If he makes that stick, the land reverts to the territory. And he's already filed a secondary petition to purchase the land from the territory at assessed value. Anika looked at the house. It was 9 weeks of work standing in the morning light, the framing complete, the exterior trim installed, the porch posts set, and the ceiling boards going up, the second floor windows fitted. It was the best thing she'd built in years. "He's been planning this since the beginning," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably longer than that." Gideon put the letter in his coat pocket. "My father's original survey was done by a man named Elias Tuck. He was the territorial surveyor at the time. He's retired now, living somewhere north of Pallister. Hale's lawyers have a statement from him. I haven't seen the statement yet, but that's what the letter says." "What does the statement say?" "That he made errors in the original survey, that the markers were set wrong." His voice was controlled in the effortful way. "My father paid that man. Stood with him in the field for 3 days while he set those markers. My father kept the field notes." "Do you still have them?" Gideon looked at her. "I don't know. I'd have to look. My father kept everything, but after he died I boxed most of it, and it's been in the lumberyard office for 4 years. He paused. "I'd have to go through all of it." "Then that's where you start," she said. She told the crew what was happening that morning, which she decided was necessary because they were going to find out anyway, and it was better coming from her than from the general direction of town. Walt listened without expression. Cobb looked stricken in the way of young men who haven't yet learned to manage their face during bad news. Rutherford, predictably, said nothing, but after the others had gone back to work, he came and stood beside her while she was measuring door casing stock. "My brother lost land to a bad title claim in '82, he said. "In the end of it, they found the surveyor had been paid off by a land company. Never proved it in court. Didn't matter by then." He picked up a length of casing and checked it for warp. "What Hale's doing, it's not new." "No," Anika said. "It isn't." "It's effective, though," Rutherford said. He set the casing down. "That's the problem with it." He went back to work. It was, she'd come to understand, his way of saying he was in this with them. For Rutherford, going back to work was the most solidarity he had. Gideon spent 2 evenings going through the boxes in the lumberyard office and found, on the second evening, his father's survey field notes. A battered journal with a cracked spine, pages water-stained at the bottom but readable. The field notes showed the survey dates, the compass bearings, the chain measurements between markers, and a rough hand-drawn plat of the property with his father's notes in the margins. He brought it to Anika the next morning. She sat with it at the saw bench for 20 minutes, going through it carefully. She was not a surveyor, but she had worked enough construction to read a plat, and what she was reading didn't match what the letter from the land office described. "These measurements," she said. "The eastern boundary chain. He ran it twice." Gideon leaned over her shoulder. "My father always said Tuck was thorough. He ran the chain twice and noted both readings, and they match within half a link. That's a careful survey." She turned to the plat. "Look at the corner markers. He's described the physical markers. Stone monuments, he says, 2 of them on the eastern line. If those are still in the ground, they'd be there 22 years later," Gideon said. "Stone doesn't walk." "So the question is whether anyone's looked." She handed him the journal. "Does Hale's petition claim the markers were set in the wrong place, or that they don't exist?" "Wrong place." "Then someone would have had to go out there and look at the existing markers and make a case that they're not where the original survey says they should be." She paused. "Or fabricate a case, depending on what Tuck's statement actually says." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I need to see that statement." "You'll see it at the hearing." 30 days is a long time to wait." "I know." She looked at him. "But you have the field notes, and if the stone markers are still in the ground, you can have your own survey done." "Who do I trust to do it?" "Someone from outside Red Mesa," she said. "Someone Hale doesn't have a connection to." Gideon thought about this. "There's a surveyor in Kellerton. Young man, been there about 3 years. I've never dealt with him, but I've heard his name mentioned without complaints attached to it. That's about the best recommendation you can hope for," Anika said. It was Marjorie Holt, of all people, who told her about the meeting. She came to the boarding house for supper on a Tuesday and found Marjorie at the table with an expression that said she had information she was going to deliver, whether Anika wanted it or not. "The Civic Committee met last night," Marjorie said, setting down the bread. "Caroline Peirce wasn't there, which was noted. Victor Hale was there, which is unusual. He doesn't usually show up himself for those things. He sends intermediaries." She sat down. "He spoke for 40 minutes. I got the account from 2 separate people who were there." "What did he say?" "He said the land dispute is evidence of long-standing problems with how Cross and Sons has operated, that the community has been patient, that the situation with—" Marjorie paused, which was its own form of information. "The hired woman has been tolerated longer than it should have been, that the committee should make a formal statement requesting that Gideon resolve his workforce situation before the hearing." Anika put down her fork. "He used the word tolerated," she said. "He used that word." She looked at the table. The bread was good tonight. Marjorie's bread always was, which was one of the reliable things about this place. She had learned to notice reliable things. You needed them. "He wants Gideon to fire me," she said. "He wants Gideon to fire you before the hearing so he can walk into that hearing as the reasonable man who had concerns that were eventually addressed." Marjorie looked at her with the plain, unsparing directness that was her natural mode. "He thinks if Gideon lets you go, the committee softens. The land office sees a man who responds to community pressure, and it helps his case." "Does it, legally?" "No, but it shapes how the commissioner sees things walking in." Marjorie picked up her fork. "Victor Hale has been doing business in this territory for 30 years. He knows that legal cases aren't decided purely on the law." Anika was quiet for a moment. "Did the committee make the statement he asked for?" "No. 3 members voted against it. One of them was Arthur Holt." A pause. "My husband's younger brother. We don't speak much, but he's not a dishonest man." "Thank him for me," Anika said. "I won't be doing that," Marjorie said, "but I'll think it loudly in his direction." She told Gideon about the committee meeting the next day. He listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he looked when he was deciding how angry to let himself be. "He wants me to let you go," Gideon said. That's the reading. What do you think I should do? She looked at him. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. She could tell by now what Gideon's rhetorical questions sounded like, and this wasn't one of them. I think you should do what you were going to do regardless, she said. But I want to say something else, and I want you to hear it without deciding what it means before I finish. All right. If letting me go would genuinely protect the land, not Hale's version of it, but actually and legally improve your position at the hearing, then you should consider it. I'm a carpenter. I can find other work. This is your father's land. Gideon was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. Are you telling me you want to leave? He said. I'm telling you I'm not so attached to my own position here that I'd let it cost you something that matters more. He looked at her for a moment, then he uncrossed his arms. It wouldn't improve my position legally. Marjorie's right that it would help with optics, but the hearing isn't an optics contest. It's a records contest. Either the survey is valid or it isn't. Either the markers are where my father's field notes say they are, or they aren't. He paused. And I'm not letting Victor Hale decide who works on my land. She nodded. All right. That's it? All right? You heard me. I said what needed saying. You answered it. She picked up her marking gauge. Now can we talk about the hearing? Because 30 days has become 22 days, and there's a surveyor in Kellerton we still haven't contacted. Woke. The surveyor from Kellerton came out the following week. His name was Pierce Donnelly, and he was younger than Gideon had expected, maybe 30, with a quiet, methodical manner and the kind of precise handwriting on his field notes that Anika recognized as the mark of a man who took his measurements seriously. He spent 2 days on the property. He located both stone monuments on the eastern boundary. They were exactly where Elias Tuck's original field notes said they should be, embedded in the ground, with the original chisel marks still visible on the faces. He ran the chain between them and compared it to the original survey measurements. He found a discrepancy of 7/8 of an inch over the full boundary length, which he noted in his report was within the acceptable error margin for surveying instruments of the period. He presented his findings at the lumberyard office on a Thursday evening. Gideon, Anika, and Gideon's lawyer, a thin man named Schofield, who had traveled up from the county seat and who communicated almost entirely in short, flat sentences that somehow contained a lot of information. The markers are where they should be, Donnelly said. The original survey is accurate within normal tolerances. Whatever Tuck's statement says, the physical evidence contradicts it. What would make a surveyor like Tuck sign a statement contradicting his own work? Anika asked. Schofield looked at her. It was the first time he'd really looked at her directly. Money, he said. Or fear. Usually money. Can we prove it? We don't need to prove it, Schofield said. We need to prove the survey is valid. Donnelly's report does that. Hale's case rests on Tuck's statement. If Tuck's statement contradicts physical evidence, the commissioner will give it appropriate weight. He paused. Which is to say, not much. But Tuck will testify in person, Gideon said. Almost certainly. Schofield put Donnelly's report in his folder. That's where it gets complicated. It was Anika who decided they needed to go to the hearing rather than simply send Schofield. She came to this conclusion on a Sunday afternoon, sitting in the empty house. They didn't work Sundays, but she sometimes came out alone to look at the progress, to stand in the rooms and think about what they were becoming. She stood in the study with the white oak beams above her head, not yet finished, the grain of the wood catching the afternoon light through the window opening. The hearing was in 12 days. In 12 days, a territorial commissioner would sit in a government room and decide whether this land belonged to Gideon or whether it would revert to the territory and be sold to Victor Hale. The legal case was in Schofield's hands, and Schofield was competent. She had come to believe that. Donnelly's survey was solid. The field notes were real. But there was something else she'd been thinking about, and she'd been thinking about it because of what Marjorie had said, that legal cases weren't decided purely on the law, that Victor Hale had been doing business in this territory for 30 years and knew how to shape a room before the law ever got to speak in it. She thought about what she'd been doing since she arrived in Red Mesa. She had worked. She had done the work and let the work speak and stayed quiet about everything else, because that had always been her strategy. Don't make yourself the issue. Let the quality speak for itself. It had been the right strategy for the first month. She wasn't sure it was the right strategy now. There was a town hall meeting in 3 days, a regular monthly gathering that various committees used to make announcements. She had attended one, briefly, and left early. But she had been thinking, since the committee meeting Marjorie had described, about what it would mean to stand up in that room. Not to make a legal argument. That wasn't her place. Just to be there. Visibly. To stop being the woman people talked about and become the woman who stood in front of them and said, "Here I am. Look at the work. Decide what you actually think." It scared her. She was honest enough with herself to say that plainly. She had stood in front of hostile rooms before, but those were rooms where she'd been judged on her work, and she had learned to trust the work. This was different. This was a room where they'd already decided, and she was going to walk into that decision and ask them to revise it, and she didn't know if the work was enough to make them do that, and she wasn't going to know until she was standing there. She walked out of the study and through the main room and out onto the porch. The territory spread out ahead of her, wide and dry and indifferent, and the sky above it was the specific deep blue of late afternoon that she had come to associate with this place. Not home, not yet, but something. She went to find Gideon. He was at the lumber yard, working late on a delivery manifest. He looked up when she came in. "The town meeting is Thursday," she said. He set down his pen. "I know. I want to speak." He looked at her for a moment. He had the field notes on the desk beside him, and Donnelly's survey report, and Schofield's preliminary brief, all the paper scaffolding of a case they were still building. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to." She sat down across from him. "I've been letting the work be the argument, and the work is a good argument. But in that hearing room in 12 days, the work doesn't walk in. We walk in. And I'd rather that commissioner see something besides Hale's version of this story before he has to decide." Gideon looked at the manifests. He looked at the field notes. He looked at her. "What are you going to say?" he said. "I'm going to tell them about the house," she said. "Not the legal case, just the house. What it is, and what it took to build it, and what it's going to be." She paused. "And I'm going to stand up in that room so that every person in it has to decide, looking at me, whether what they think they know about me is actually true." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be hard," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded once, slowly, the same way he'd nodded when she'd said she'd be at the site at sunrise on the first day. "All right," he said. "Thursday." She stood up. "There's also Tuck," she said. "Elias Tuck. If his statement contradicts the physical evidence, someone paid him or pressured him to say what he said. And if that's true, then the original statement might not be all he knows," Gideon said. He had gone still in the way that meant he was thinking something through that he hadn't finished yet. If someone leaned on Tuck hard enough to get a false statement, there might be records of it, payments, correspondence. He looked up. He's an old man now, living alone north of Pallister. Men who've been pressured into something they're ashamed of sometimes want to be asked about it, Annika said. Sometimes they just need someone to show up and ask the right question. Gideon picked up his pen. Then he set it down again. "Pallister's 2 days' ride." "The hearing is in 12 days, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and the lamp between them cast the same light on both their faces. And outside the lumberyard, the town of Red Mesa went about its evening without knowing that 2 people in a small office were deciding what to do about the next 12 days. "I'll leave Friday morning," he said. "Then I'll handle the site," she said. She walked out into the dark, and the air smelled like sawdust and dry earth, and somewhere far off something was blooming, and she had 12 days, and that was what she had to work with. Thursday came fast. Annika had 3 days on the site without Gideon, which was strange in the way that a room is strange when furniture you've gotten used to has been moved. Not worse, just different, and requiring adjustment. She kept the crew on the interior finish work, the main room ceiling, the hallway casing, the window trim on the second floor. Rutherford worked on the built-in cabinetry in the study with a focus that bordered on religious fitting and refitting the drawer boxes until the gaps were even to the width of a playing card. Walt framed the last partition wall in the upstairs bedroom. Cobb sanded. He was good at sanding, patient and systematic in a way that didn't come naturally to him in other areas of his life, but appeared fully formed when he had sandpaper in his hand. She didn't tell them about the town hall meeting until Wednesday evening, when they were packing up. "I'm going to speak tomorrow night," she said. Walt looked at her. Cobb stopped moving. Rutherford, with his back to her, went still for a moment and then kept packing up his tools. "About the land dispute," Cobb said. "About the house. About the work." She picked up her toolbox. "I'm not asking any of you to be there. It's nothing to do with your wages or the job." A pause. "I'll be there," Cobb said. Walt shrugged. "I was going anyway. My wife wants to hear about the new water committee proposal. I'll stay for your part." He said it as though attendance were simply a scheduling matter. Rutherford said nothing. But the next morning he arrived at the site carrying a clean shirt folded over his arm alongside his tool bag, which told her everything she needed to know. The town hall was in a long, low building behind the post office that served multiple purposes: public meetings, occasional court sessions, a space for market overflow in bad weather. By 7 o'clock it was fuller than Anika had expected. Red Mesa didn't always turn out for its monthly meetings, but word had gotten around, in the specific way that word gets around in a small town, which is to say, completely and with embellishments, that there was going to be something worth watching. She sat in the third row. Not at the back, where you could pretend you weren't there. Not at the front, which was its own kind of performance. Third row, which was where you sat when you intended to be present. Victor Hale was in the front row on the opposite side. He had two men with him that she didn't recognize. Suits, not workwear, which meant they were either lawyers or the kind of businessmen who wanted to look like lawyers. He did not look at her when she came in, which was deliberate in the way that not looking is always deliberate. The meeting covered 3 items before it got to her: water committee, a road maintenance question, a proposal to extend the market hours on Saturdays, normal town business, the kind that goes on regardless of everything else, which was oddly steadying. Life continues its practical business. Water still needs managing, roads still need maintaining. The committee chair, a man named Burgess, whom she'd seen but never spoken to, announced open comments. He looked at his paper, then looked up with the specific expression of a man who had been expecting this moment and had not decided how he felt about it. "Miss Anika Van Doren has requested to address the floor," he said. She stood. The room did the thing rooms do. The quality of silence changed. Not quieter exactly, but more focused. She could feel it on her skin, which was unpleasant, and she was not going to let it show, which cost her something. "Thank you," she said to Burgess, and then she turned to the room. She had thought about what to say for 3 days. Not a speech. She wasn't good at speeches, and she knew it, and a prepared speech in this room would read as exactly what it was. She was going to talk about the house. She was going to be direct, and she was going to be brief, and she was not going to apologize for being there. "I've been in Red Mesa for 11 weeks, she said. "Most of you know who I am or know a version of it. I'm not going to stand up here and argue about the version." A few people shifted. She kept her voice level. "I'm going to tell you about a house." She told them about the foundation, the drainage tile they'd run to manage the grade change, the detail that would prevent the rear addition from flooding in spring and rotting from the base. She told them about the window rough openings and why a window that sits level in its frame matters not just aesthetically but structurally, how a racked opening transfers load unevenly and creates problems 5 years out that are expensive to fix. She told them about the box beam ceiling in the study and the white oak she'd sourced from Kellerton when the local supplier couldn't fill the order. She described the cabinet joinery, the mortise and tenon she'd cut by hand because the mechanical joint doesn't fit tight enough, and why that matters in a dry climate where wood moves with the season. She talked for 8 minutes. She talked about the work the way her father had talked about it, not with pride exactly, more with the straightforward respect that the work deserved when it was done right. Then she stopped. "That's what I've been building for 11 weeks, she said. "Whatever else you've heard about me, the house is there. You can go look at it." She paused. "That's all I wanted to say." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Burgess said, "Thank you, Miss Van Doren," in a voice that was trying to be neutral and mostly succeeding. Victor Hale's expression hadn't changed. The two suited men with him were writing something down. From the back of the room, Caroline Pers, who had not been at the civic committee meeting that Hale had attended, which Annika hadn't forgotten, spoke up without being called on. "I'd like to see it," Caroline Pers said. "The house. If that's something that can be arranged." A beat of silence. "It can be arranged," Annika said. She walked back to the boarding house afterward with Walt and Cobb on either side of her, and Rutherford slightly behind, which was his natural position in any group. And the night air was cool, and the town was doing its quiet evening things. And Cobb said, "That was good," in a voice that suggested he'd been worrying about it and was relieved. "It was fine," Annika said. "I thought you were going to say more," Walt said. "More would have been worse." Marjorie was still up when she got back, which was unusual. She was at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup that had probably been warm 2 hours ago. She looked at Annika with an expression that was making room for something. "Two people stopped me after," Marjorie said, "before I got back. People who'd been at the meeting." She paused. "Arthur Holt was one of them. He said you gave the right speech. He said Victor's been spreading money around the territory for 20 years, and the first time someone stood up in front of the room and just talked about the actual work..." She stopped. "He said something shifted in there. I don't know what it means practically, but I thought you should know." Annika sat down. The kitchen was warm and it smelled like bread from that morning. "Gideon's in Pallister," she said. "I know," Marjorie said. "He'll be back by Sunday." "The hearing is Monday." "I know that too." Marjorie stood up and poured the cold cup out and rinsed it. "You should sleep." Gideon rode back Sunday afternoon. She was at the site when she heard the horse on the road, and she came out from the interior where she'd been fitting the last of the study shelving to see him coming up the track. He looked tired in the way of a man who had been riding and not sleeping much, and he had something in his saddlebag that he pulled out before he'd even tied the horse, a thin leather folder, worn at the edges. "Tuck," she said. "Tuck," he said. He came inside to the main room, which was finished now except for the floor varnish that they were saving until last. He sat on a saw bench and opened the folder. "He's old," Gideon said. 74. Lives by himself on a small parcel north of Pallister with 2 dogs and a kitchen garden." He looked at the papers in the folder. "I rode up to his place on Saturday morning. He saw me coming from the window. By the time I knocked, he'd already opened the door." "He was expecting someone," Annika said. "He'd been expecting someone for 2 months, since he signed the statement. He told me it took the man Hale sent 3 visits to get him to do it. First visit was a request, framed politely. Second visit was less polite. Third visit..." Gideon paused. "The third man wasn't one of Hale's lawyers. He was someone else, and Tuck couldn't tell me his name, but he was clear about what was implied. And Tuck signed anyway." "He's 74 and alone," Gideon said. Not excusing it, just stating it. "What's in the folder?" Gideon handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a handwritten statement from Elias Tuck, dated 4 days ago, retracting his earlier deposition and affirming that the original survey of the Cross property had been conducted correctly, that the markers had been set according to the measurements recorded in his field notes, and that his prior statement had been made under duress. The second document was something else, a receipt, faded but legible, signed by Tuck and dated from 22 years ago, acknowledging payment from the Territorial Land Office for the original survey work. The payment amount, the property description, the signature, all of it consistent with the field notes Gideon's father had kept. "He gave you the original receipt," she said. "He'd kept it. He kept everything, apparently. He said..." Gideon stopped, and something moved across his face that he controlled quickly. "He said my father was one of the most decent men he'd ever surveyed for. Said he'd felt sick since he signed that statement. Said he'd rather have whatever trouble came from telling the truth than spend whatever time he had left living with the other thing." The room was quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the site, carrying the smell of sawdust and dry grass. "Schofield needs to see this before tomorrow morning," she said. "I'm writing to him tonight." "Gideon." He looked at her. "The receipt alone, The original payment record combined with Donnelly's survey and the field notes. I know, he said. I know what it means. He took the folder back, held it carefully. Hale built his case on Tuck's statement. Without it, he has nothing but a petition and a theory. He paused. With Tuck's retraction, he has less than nothing. He has evidence that someone pressured a retired surveyor into filing a false deposition. She looked at him. He looked back. That's a different kind of problem for him, she said. Yes, Gideon said. It is. She didn't go to the hearing. This was a deliberate choice, and it cost her something to make it. She had 12 weeks in this town by now, and she had stood up in front of it and said, "Here I am, look at the work," and she wanted to be in that room and see the thing through to its end. But Schofield had been clear. The hearing was a legal proceeding, not a public forum. The parties were Gideon and the Territorial Land Office. Anika had no standing to be in the room, and her presence in the building would give Hale something to point at and talk about. The case was solid. She needed to let it be solid without adding herself to it. She went to the site instead. She worked alone most of Monday morning. Walt came by mid-morning and worked without asking questions, which was his way of being supportive. Rutherford arrived at noon. Cobb showed up at 1 o'clock with a distracted energy that meant he'd been somewhere listening for news and hadn't heard any yet. The floor varnish went on at 2 o'clock. She'd been waiting for a still day, no wind through the open windows to carry dust onto the wet surface, and this was it. She worked from the back of the main room toward the door, on her knees, moving slowly. The varnish went on clear and then shifted as it set to a warm amber that deepened the grain of the wood. She was halfway across the floor when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it. The particular sound of a horse being ridden fast on the dry road and then pulled back hard at the gate. She sat up from the floor and looked at the door. Gideon came in on foot, coat dusty from the ride, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her kneeling on the half-varnished floor with a brush in her hand. "Don't walk on the floor," she said. He stopped. "Well?" she said. He looked like a man who had been holding something for a long time and had just been given permission to put it down. "Dismissed," he said. "Hale's petition dismissed in full. Donnelly's survey accepted as the operative record. My father's field notes entered as supporting documentation." He paused. Tuck's retraction was read into the record. The commissioner noted that the circumstances of the original deposition may warrant further investigation. She looked at the varnish brush in her hand. "Further investigation," she said, "into who pressured him and how." Gideon was still standing in the doorway, not walking on her floor, which she appreciated. Schofield says Hale's lawyers went pale when the retraction was read. Apparently they hadn't been told their own client had done anything actionable in obtaining the statement. He didn't tell his own lawyers. Apparently he did it through an intermediary, which makes it cleaner for him and dirtier at the same time, because now the intermediary has a problem and the intermediary knows things. Gideon shook his head slightly. Schofield says Hale will be managing this quietly for quite some time. The floor between them was half amber and half raw wood. She'd finish it before dark if she started again now. "The land is yours," she said. "The land is mine," he said. She looked at the floor. "I need to finish this before the light goes." He looked at the wet varnish and the half-finished floor and the house around them. His father's house, the house he'd been building toward for 4 years before she came, the house that was almost done. "I'll make coffee," he said. "There's no stove yet. I'll figure something out." He went around the building to the exterior, where the temporary cook setup was, and she went back to the floor. When she finished the main room and came outside, Gideon was sitting on the porch steps with 2 cups of coffee that he had, in fact, figured out. She sat beside him. Not close. Just on the same steps, which were solid under them, which Anika knew because she had fitted the stringer boards herself and checked the rise and run twice. "Caroline Peirce came to see the house on Friday," she said. "While you were gone." "I heard." "Who told you?" "Walt. He said she walked through every room and didn't say much, and then at the end she said it was finer work than she'd seen in the territory." He paused. He seemed fairly pleased about it. Walt is pleased about craftsmanship. It's the one thing that gets through. "I know." Gideon looked out at the property. The afternoon light on the dry grass, the lumberyard in the distance, the road curving back toward town. Arthur Holt came by the hearing today. He wasn't a party to anything. He just sat in the public gallery. He paused. He caught me on the way out and said he wanted to apologize for the committee's statement that was proposed, the one that didn't pass. He said he should have said something to stop it from being proposed in the first place. What did you tell him? I told him I appreciated him saying so. He looked at his coffee cup. That's all it needed. She thought about Marjorie's brother-in-law sitting in a public gallery that he didn't need to be in, and the committee vote that had gone 3 against Hale's proposal, and the 2 people who had stopped Marjorie after the town hall meeting to say something had shifted, and Caroline Peirce walking through the rooms of the house with her mouth quiet and her eyes taking it in. Things didn't change all at once. That was the truth of it. You didn't stand up in a room and give a speech and watch opinion reverse itself like a tide going out. What happened was smaller and slower. A door that had been closed a crack opened a crack wider, and you still had to push on it, and it still resisted, and maybe it never opened all the way. But the crack was there. The crack was real. There are still people in this town who think you should have let me go, she said. There are, Gideon agreed. There will be, for a while. And Hale still lives here. He does. He'll be quieter about it going forward, but he's not leaving. He looked at her. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. Not as much as it did 2 months ago, but yes. He nodded. Fair enough. They sat with the coffee cooling in their hands and the property around them in the late afternoon quiet, and the floor she'd just varnished was drying inside, and the house was almost done. The trim on the rear addition, she said. What about it? There's a section on the north corner that I'm not happy with. The miter's a hair off. I caught it yesterday. I want to redo it before we call the exterior complete. Gideon looked at her. A hair off. It'll bother me every time I see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, fix it then. I was going to, she said. I just wanted you to know. She stood up, set her cup down on the step, and went to get her tools. The north corner trim took her 2 hours to redo. It didn't need 2 hours. Technically, it was 40 minutes of work, but she took her time with it, cutting the miter twice on scrap before she cut it on the finish piece, checking the angle with a sliding bevel until it matched exactly what she wanted. When she nailed it home and stood back, the joint was clean. Invisible, almost, the way a good miter should be. The 2 pieces of wood met at the corner like they'd grown that way. Nobody would notice it. That wasn't the point. The point was that she would know it was right, and she would know because she'd been the one to make it right, and that mattered to her in a way that she'd stopped trying to explain to people who didn't already understand it. She packed her tools as the last light left the property, and she walked back to town in the cooling dark, and the house stood behind her on the hill in the way that finished things stand, with a settled, quiet authority that has nothing to prove. There were 3 weeks left before she'd call it done. The letter from Amsterdam arrived on a Thursday, forwarded from a postal address she'd left with Jan before she departed, which meant it had been chasing her for nearly 2 months. The envelope was thick, and Jan's handwriting on the outside was slightly less controlled than usual, which told her something before she opened it. She read it at the boarding house table after supper, with Marjorie doing something quiet in the kitchen, and the evening going about its business outside. It was not from Jan. It was from Peter Vogel, who had been her father's closest colleague for 20 years, and who now ran a furniture and carpentry workshop of his own in the eastern part of Amsterdam. A proper operation, 8 craftsmen, contracts with merchant houses, and a good reputation that had taken him 30 years to build. He wrote in Dutch, which felt strange to read after months of English, like hearing a song in a key you'd forgotten was a key. Peter's workshop was doing well. He was getting older, and his hands were not what they had been. He was looking for someone to take a senior role in the operation, not just a craftsman, but someone who could manage the contracts and oversee the work, and eventually, when the time came, take over. He had thought of her. He had thought of her specifically. He had spoken to Jan, who had mentioned she was in the territories, and he had tracked down her forwarding address through 2 letters and a conversation with a man at the Amsterdam shipping office who apparently owed Peter a favor. He was offering her a partnership, not employment, partnership, Her name on the letterhead, a share of the profits. The workshop that her father had always admired from a respectful distance. The one he had told her about when she was 10 years old. The one she had visited twice as a girl and walked through with her eyes wide open, touching the workbenches, smelling the curled shavings on the floor. Peter Vogel was offering her that. She read the letter twice, then folded it on its original creases and set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a while. Outside, the saloon was doing its usual Thursday business. A cart went past on the street. The ordinary sounds. Marjorie came to the doorway and looked at her. "Good news or bad news?" she said. She had the instinct of a woman who had run a boarding house for 15 years. She could read the quality of someone's silence from another room. "I'm not sure yet," Anika said. "Good news, I think, which is complicated." Marjorie came in, looked at the letter without reading it. She wouldn't read someone else's letter, and sat down. "Tell me," Anika told her. "Not all of it, but enough. A partnership offer. Amsterdam. The workshop she'd wanted since she was a child." Marjorie was quiet for a moment. "When do you have to decide?" "He's given me until the end of the season." "That's generous." "Peter's always been generous." She looked at the letter. "It's what I would have wanted a year ago, 2 years ago. It's what I came to the territories working toward. In a way, I came to build my credentials so that someday something like this would be possible." She paused. "And now it is." Marjorie looked at her with the flat, perceptive directness that was her defining characteristic. "But," she said. "But," Anika said. She didn't tell Gideon about the letter right away. She told herself this was because the timing wasn't right. They were in the final stretch of the house, the interior finishes coming together, and she didn't want to introduce a complicated conversation into the middle of complicated work. This was true enough to believe for about 4 days. On the 5th day, she admitted to herself that she was afraid of the conversation, which was different and less comfortable to sit with. What she was afraid of specifically was this. She had built something here. Not just the house, she had built slowly and with difficulty a version of herself in this place. The woman who showed up in the 3rd row at town hall and talked about drainage tile and mortise and tenon joints. The woman whose crew came to the meeting in clean shirts. The woman Rutherford had wordlessly decided was worth defending by going back to work. She had built that the way you build anything, one day at a time, one joint at a time, without knowing what the whole thing would look like until you stepped back from it. And Peter Vogel was offering her a door back into the life she'd had before she built this one. She thought about her father. Not the difficult parts. They were there. They were real. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But the parts that mattered, the parts that lived in his tools, the way he moved around a workbench, the things he said about wood and time, and the particular satisfaction of making something that would last. He had worked in a small shop his whole life, and he had made fine things in it, and he had died before he saw his daughter make fine things. And that was a fact she was going to carry forever. But she didn't think he would have told her to take the partnership because it was what she'd wanted at 10 years old. She didn't think he would have told her to take anything because of what she'd wanted before she knew what she could want. She thought he would have told her to look at the work she'd already done and ask herself honestly what kind of work she wanted to do next. She told Gideon on a Saturday 2 weeks before the house was finished. They were in the study. His study, the room with the white oak beams and the built-in cabinetry and the mortise and tenon joints that nobody would see. She was fitting the last section of bookcase trim, and he was there because he came to this room more than any other room in the building, which she had known for a while and not said anything about. She told him about the letter. She told him straight, the way she'd told him about the scaffold accident and William Ashe and the rumors the town had been circulating, plainly, without softening the edges. He was quiet for a long time after. "A partnership," he said. "Yes." "In Amsterdam." "Yes." He looked at the bookcase. The shelves were fitted and the trim was going on in the last section, the final piece of cabinetry in the room. He reached out and touched the edge of one shelf, checking the level out of habit. "It's what you want," he said. It was not entirely a question. "It's what I wanted," she said. "I'm trying to work out whether they're the same thing." He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in this room months ago, that night she'd been working late on the face frames, not seeing what he expected to see, but seeing her. "What would you need to know to work that out?" he said. She set down the piece of trim she was holding. "I'd need to know what I'm leaving," she said. "That's the part I keep coming back to. A year ago I didn't have anything to weigh against it. Now I'm trying to figure out the weight." A silence. "You could tell me what you want," she said. "That would help me know the weight." Gideon looked at the bookcase for a moment longer. Then he looked at the room, the beams, the cabinetry, the afternoon light coming through the window that sat perfectly level in its frame. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at her. "I need to say something that I should have said weeks ago," he said, "possibly months ago. I'm saying it now because I was working up to it, and then the land dispute happened, and there didn't seem to be a right time, and I've decided waiting for a right time is just a different way of being a coward." She waited. "I didn't just need a carpenter," he said. "I could have hired a carpenter. I've hired carpenters before." He paused, and it was the pause of a man choosing words carefully because he meant them. "I needed someone who would look at the cupped board in the lumberyard and catch it before I mentioned it. Someone who knew about drainage tile and would say so even when I hadn't asked. Someone who would stand up in a town hall and talk about joinery to a room full of people who'd been trying to push her out for 3 months, and do it clearly, without flinching." He stopped. "I don't want you to go to Amsterdam. I want you to stay here, not as my carpenter, as my partner, in the actual sense. Both senses, if you're willing." The room was very quiet. "Both senses?" she said. "I'm not graceful about this," Gideon said. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." "I know you're not graceful about it," she said. "I've been watching you for 4 months. You're not graceful about most things. You're very good at them, but graceful isn't the word." "Is that a problem?" She looked at him. She thought about the things she knew about this man. The way he waited until you were finished talking, the way he came to the study more than any other room, the field notes he'd kept in a box for 4 years because they were his father's, the way he'd ridden 18 miles to Vernon for lumber without making it into a story. She thought about the crew he'd assembled, who had turned out to be in their various ways decent people. She thought about the property outside and the town at the end of the road, which was difficult and imperfect and had been, slowly, changing. "No," she said, "it's not a problem." He looked at her carefully. "So you're staying?" "I'm staying," she said. "I'm going to write to Peter and tell him no. He'll find someone else. He has time." She picked up the piece of trim she'd set down. "Now, let me finish this bookcase." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled up the other saw bench and sat down, the way he sat when he was going to stay for a while, and she went back to the trim, and the afternoon light moved across the white oak beams above them, and nobody said anything more for a long time, and it was enough. The house was finished on a Tuesday. The last thing was the front door hardware, the handle set and the hinges, which were plain brass, not decorative, because Gideon didn't want decorative and Annika agreed with him. She fitted them in the morning while the crew did the final walkthrough, checking everything against the plan with the thoroughness of people who have lived inside a project long enough to be afraid of what they've missed. They hadn't missed much. One section of baseboard in the upstairs bedroom needed a nail set. A window latch on the second floor was slightly stiff, and Cobb spent 20 minutes with a file adjusting the strike until it caught cleanly. The rear addition floor had a soft spot near the east wall that turned out to be nothing structural, just a board that needed a screw-driven home. Walt walked the porch and pushed on each post and announced that they were solid, which everyone already knew, but Walt was a man who needed to push on things personally before he was satisfied. Rutherford spent a long time in the study. She didn't go in to rush him. When he came out, his expression was the same as always, which was to say not entirely readable, but he looked at her and said, "Good work," which from Rutherford was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You too," she said. She meant it. At noon, Gideon stood in the front room with all 4 of them, Walt, Cobb, Rutherford, Annika, and said what needed to be said, which was that it was a fine house and they had built it, and he was grateful. He said it without ceremony, without making it more than it was, which was exactly right. Cobb looked like he might get emotional, thought better of it, and settled for shaking Gideon's hand very firmly. Walt accepted his final wages with a nod and said he'd heard there was framing work in Kellerton, which was about as close to a farewell speech as Walt was going to give. Rutherford took his pay envelope, put it in his coat, and said, "I'll be around," and walked off down the road, which Anika chose to interpret as fondness. She stayed. That afternoon, she drove the first nail into what would be the workshop addition, a separate structure off the rear of the house, her workshop, which had not been on the original plan because it hadn't needed to be on the original plan before. It was her own design. Modest, a single room, 16 by 20, with north-facing windows for even light and a workbench along the south wall and storage for the tools that had been her father's and were now hers. She had been carrying a vision of it in her head for 6 weeks since she'd first decided to stay, and she had put it on paper 3 weeks ago and looked at it every night before she slept and adjusted it until it was right. The first nail went in clean. She didn't make anything of it, didn't pause for effect. She moved to the next one. This was how it worked in the end. Not a moment. Not a single turn where everything changed. Just the work, one nail at a time, one day at a time, the accumulation of small, careful decisions that became, over time, something real, something that stood. There are people who believe you earn belonging, that you prove yourself through enough patience or enough sacrifice or enough success until the place you're in finally grants you permission to be there. Annika had believed that for a long time. She had worked that way, performed that way, justified herself that way, and she understood now that it was only partly true. The work mattered, the quality mattered, showing up and doing it right, that was real. But belonging wasn't a thing that other people gave you when you'd finally done enough. She had figured that out somewhere between the town hall speech and the trip to Aldrich's hardware store and the north corner trim that nobody would ever notice. You built belonging the same way you built a house, not by waiting for permission, but by starting, by choosing the site and digging the footings and showing up in the morning, even on the mornings that were hard, especially on those. Red Mesa had not welcomed her. It had tolerated her, then watched her, then begun, in the grudging, uneven way of actual places with actual people, to see her. That wasn't the same as belonging, but it was the material you worked with. You didn't get to choose your material, only what you made of it. She thought about Jan's letter, still somewhere in her coat pocket, still waiting for an answer she kept putting off writing because she couldn't find the words for it. She thought she knew them now, not an explanation. Jan wouldn't want an explanation, and she wasn't interested in providing one. Just the simple fact, she had found her situation. It was here. She thought about Peter Vogel's workshop, the one she'd walked through at 10 years old with her eyes wide open. She hoped he'd find his person. She thought he would. The kind of man who tracked someone down through 2 letters and a shipping clerk's favor was the kind of man who usually found what he was looking for. She thought about her father, the worn handles of his tools, the weight of the mallet that she'd swung 10,000 times since she was small. She thought about what it meant to carry something forward, not to preserve it exactly, but to use it, to let the thing that was given to you become the thing that you make. The afternoon moved across the property. The main house stood behind her, the first real thing she had built in this territory. The house that had made it through a land dispute and a campaign of pressure and 12 weeks of work by 4 people who were variously difficult, competent, and imperfect in their different ways, which was to say, people. Gideon came out at 4 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the ground nearby, not interfering, just present. She noticed he'd started doing that, being near without needing to direct, which was a thing she appreciated about him more than she'd told him. "Workshop framing by end of week," he said, "if the delivery from Kellerton comes through." She drove another nail. "Which it will." "You seem confident." "I am." She looked at the nail she'd just set. "I ordered from Kellerton 4 days ago, and they haven't given me a reason not to trust them yet." "That's the bar? Haven't failed yet?" "That's the bar for everybody," she said. "You just keep showing up until someone gives you a reason to stop." She looked at him. "Nobody's given me one here." He looked at her over his coffee cup. The sun was going southwest, the way it did this time of year, and the light on the dry grass and the new lumber framing was the color of something she didn't have a word for in either language. "No," he said. "Nobody's giving you one." She drove the next nail. The workshop framing went up by Thursday, 2 days ahead of her estimate, which she did not find satisfying in the way people expect you to find things satisfying. It was a preliminary framing. There was still sheathing and roofing and windows and the interior to do, and none of that was going to finish itself. But the bones were up, and the bones were square, and the north-facing window openings would let in the kind of light she needed. And in 6 weeks she would hang her father's tools on a wall in a room she had designed herself on land that belonged to the man she had chosen, and that was a fact the world was going to have to deal with. The town would have opinions about it. The town always had opinions. Arthur Holt would be decent about it, and Caroline Peirce would be careful, and Victor Hale would be quieter than he'd been, and not quiet enough. And Marjorie would say whatever she thought regardless. That was Red Mesa. That was any place, really. People being themselves at varying levels of grace and difficulty, and you living inside that reality and doing the work anyway. She was still the stranger in some rooms, and would be for a while. She knew that. She'd stopped expecting it to change all at once and started expecting it to change slowly, the way everything real changes, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look up, and the thing you've been building is standing there complete, and you realize you don't remember the exact moment it became what it is. You only know that it is, and that you built it, and that it's yours. On Friday evening, she sat on the porch steps of the main house with Gideon beside her, and the workshop framing visible through the gap in the trees, just the skeleton of it, the bones of the next thing. The light was going. Somewhere in town, a horse was being ridden somewhere with purpose. The ordinary sounds of ordinary evening in a place that was slowly becoming ordinary to her in the way that only places you've stayed long enough can become. She reached into her coat pocket and found the letter from Jan that she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. She unfolded it, read the last line again. If you should find yourself without a situation, and then she folded it back up and set it on the step beside her. Tomorrow she would write back. She would tell him she had her situation. She would not explain it at length, because Jan would not read the length. He would skim it, looking for the decision, and he would find the decision, and he would think what he thought about it, which was his right. She had stopped needing him to understand. "What's that?" Gideon said. He'd seen her with the letter. "Something I've been putting off answering," she said. "Ready to answer it now?" She looked at the property around them, the house, the workshop frame, the land that had been fought over and won, the dry grass and the darkening sky and all of it. "Yes," she said. "I know what to say." She put the letter back in her pocket. The porch was solid under them. The workshop would be done in 6 weeks. There was a delivery from Kellerton coming Monday. She had arrived in Red Mesa with her father's toolbox and a torn scrap of newspaper and nowhere particular to belong. She had built her belonging the only way she knew how, the way she'd built everything, with her hands, with care, with the stubborn insistence that the work be right, even in the places nobody would see. That was enough. That had always been enough. She just needed a place to prove it. The evening settled around them, and she stayed.